Good afternoon, Scotland and the rest of the UK. Good morning if you're in the USA, and good evening, anyone from Asia, and welcome to this event from the Asia Scotland Institute. My name is Martin Pobrick, and I'll moderate the discussion today. With us also from the Asia Scotland Institute, we have Roddy Gao, the chairman and founder of the Institute, and also Rick Minchon, who's the head of development for Asia Scotland Institute. And if I could just introduce Rick, who spent the last decade working in Beijing largely, and is a fluent Mandarin speaker and brings us a great deal of insight into China, which we all need at the moment. So we're very grateful to have Rick with us today as well. Our focus today is a discussion of I think we can all agree, probably the worsening situation in Myanmar, and quite a heart-wrenching situation as well with some of the things that are happening. And our guests today have been regular commentators on Myanmar and indeed wider issues in Asia, both really experts on all matters regarding to parts of Asia. If I can just introduce them by their background, Dr. Azeem Ibrahim is the Director of Special Initiatives at the New Lines Institute for Strategy and Policy in Washington, DC, Research Professor at the Strategic Studies Institute at US Army War College, and a very regular columnist for Foreign Policy magazine. He has a PhD from the University of Cambridge, also fellowships at Oxford, Harvard, and Yale. He's the author of two, I would say seminal books, but actually I was advised by a lady in a university in Australia last week not to use the word seminal anymore. So the most authoritative books, I think, The Rohingyas, Inside Myanmar's Hidden Genocide, and in 2016, and Radical Origins, Why We're Losing the War Against Islamic Extremism. For someone so accomplished, his accomplishments are rather lengthy, and Azeem has also served as a reservist in the 4th Battalion Parachute Regiment in the UK, and we're very, very glad that he's a regular contributor to the Asia Scotland Institute, and a contributor to Scotland as well in a number of other initiatives he's involved in. So it's always very, very good to see him back here. Going south of the border, Bill Hayton, appointed an associate fellow with the Asia Pacific program at Chatham House in 2015. And Bill worked with the BBC as a journalist from 1998, I understand, until the beginning of this year. He spent a year seconded to the state broadcaster in Myanmar in 2013-14, working on media development, which I'm sure he can tell us a little bit about later on. He spent some time in Vietnam also. He was the BBC's lead reporter in Vietnam in 2006-7. And that reflects one of his books, Vietnam Rising Dragon in 2010. And I think probably his most well-known work was the South China Sea, the struggle for power in Asia, which may not have seemed as timely in 2014 as it does now, Bill. It clearly is one of the most important commentaries on the issues in the South China Sea. And equally important, I think Bill's latest book in 2020, The Invention of China, which I would highly recommend to everyone to better understand the nature of China as a state as it is now. Bill was awarded a PhD from Cambridge for his work on the South China Sea disputes, and is a fellow of the Royal Geographical Society. With that, can I please hand over to Bill to give us your views on what's happening now, what may happen in the future in regard to Myanmar. Bill, thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Martin, and thanks to the Institute and to everybody for organising this, and Eid Mubarak to those who are celebrating today. Now, my sort of perspective on this is what I think is going to happen rather than what I would like to happen. Myanmar is in a crisis, and it needs to find a way out, and the region needs to help it if at all possible. We're seeing large numbers of people being killed, injured, detained. We're seeing the Myanmar military, the Tatmadaw, reverting to its old ways of behaving. It's in some ways it's back to the period before 2011. It's like we've gone back a decade to the bad days of military rule before the democratization process really began. I'll show you just a couple of a picture to sort of show you how I got interested and involved in this. So back in 2013-14, I was seconded from the BBC to MRTV, which is the state broadcaster in Myanmar. And this is the headquarters. So you can maybe just make out this sort of spaceship-like building that was constructed in the middle of a paddy field, basically. It's the army built an entirely new capital, Naypyidaw, more or less in the middle of nowhere, but quite close to its bunkers in the hills, and a new capital there. And then just a bit further north of that, they built this rather extravagant television station. Inside were facilities that were just as good as things that the BBC had at the time. But importantly, there was an army barracks at the end of the road. So we were always aware that if anything ever went wrong from the army's perspective, that it was very easy for them to impose control. We hoped that we were doing a little bit to kind of put that in the past, but obviously things snapped back in the end of January, beginning of February this year. And suddenly the army's plans to retake power, which I guess had been always there in some filing cabinet ready, were put into action. And since then, we've seen almost 800 people killed. This is data from the Burmese Association for Political Prisoners, and they're probably the most reliable source of information about the number of people killed and arrested. And you can see, so the coup was on the 1st of February, and there was about a month when there was a sort of, they tolerated the protests. I think they thought they were going to be able to co-opt enough people who were unhappy with the old government, because the NLD, the National League for Democracy government of Aung San Suu Kyi, did have plenty of critics. The economic growth and that sort of thing were not that impressive. And maybe they thought they could get enough support from people to actually have an uncontested coup. But that lasted for about a month, and then the crackdown really began on the 1st of March. You saw the number of people killed escalated very, very quickly from about the middle of the month. And then on Armed Forces Day, on the 27th of March, there were about 100 people killed on a single day. And then when that didn't deter people, the army started using heavier and heavier weapons. So in the city of Bago, on the 9th of April, you literally had the army using either mortars or rifle grenades against civilian demonstrators, killing about 80 people in a single day. And then as the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, started to talk about convening a leaders summit, as people began to be more frightened about the possibility of being killed on street protests, you'll see the number of protests declined and the number of people being killed per day also declined to sort of 1 or 2 a day at the moment. So it's an ongoing, very, very grim situation. And the question I think really is what can the world do about it? I think for me the most important fact is that the Tatmadaw, the military, have 300,000 well-armed, relatively well-disciplined soldiers. They've also got about 100,000 in the police as well. It's a proper army with artillery and jet fighters and all the rest of it. And they're facing, in terms of an armed opposition, groups of guerrillas, ethnic armed organizations around the edges of the country in the border areas, who have some heavier weapons, but nothing like the kind of weapons that the Myanmar military have. And they lack a united structure. Although they have sort of, sometimes quite effective guerrilla forces, they're not a cohesive unit by any means. We're seeing pictures now of some of the people who are leading the peaceful civilian protests in the cities, going to the hills and joining up with some of these armed organizations and talking about launching an armed insurgency. And we're starting to see bombs going off in some places in the cities. But my feeling is that there is nothing like the kind of firepower or organization or support among these groups that could actually dislodge the military in a fight, unless it's going to be an incredibly long and protracted and bloody campaign. I mentioned that Armed Forces Day event on the 27th of March. And while there were protests in the streets outside in which 100 people were being killed, there was a big parade in the army headquarters And it's notable that all 5 of Myanmar's neighbors turned up. So China, India, Bangladesh, Laos, and Thailand all sent representatives to that parade, along with Vietnam and Russia, Russia being a major arms supplier to the Myanmar military, and Pakistan all turned up. So all of Myanmar's neighbors are working to some extent with the military government or prepared to deal with it in some form. And of course, Thailand is a country that's under a form of military government. I mean, it had a coup and transitioned to a quasi-civilian government. And there seem to be quite strong links between Thailand's military government and what's happened in Myanmar. And I think to some extent, whereas we used to say that Myanmar's military was following an Indonesian model, that the military in Indonesia had taken power and then gradually withdrawn from politics, that when that was the trajectory that we hoped that Myanmar was going to follow. Now it looks like they think that Thailand is the model to follow. You have a coup, you rig the constitution, and then you kind of put generals in civilian uniforms and they take over the country, but without really having democracy. And that seems to be the kind of ambition, I think, for the Myanmar military at the moment. So given that situation, that the country's neighbors are maintaining working relations with the junta, what room is there for outsiders to attempt to, for example, isolate the country? I mean, had people talking about, well, could there be a no-fly zone to prevent attacks on minority groups, for example? Well, I mean, not without the support of Thailand or China or India or Bangladesh. It'd be very, very hard to do that. How can you impose sanctions if you can't monitor border controls? That kind of thing. It will be very, very hard. So I think we've been here before. There are some elements of this that have similarities with the uprisings in 1988 and then again in 2007. We've seen the same brutal military response to both of them. We've seen a vibrant pro-democracy movements emerge and continue to defy the restrictions and the repression where it can. But I think there are some significant differences now to back then, to those 2 previous periods of protest and coup. The most obvious, of course, is the rise of China. And I think that's really colouring the diplomatic perceptions of what's going on here. Everything is kind of seen in terms of a great game type framework where if Western countries impose sanctions, attempt to isolate Myanmar, there's a sense that China will just replace whatever the West has been doing or fill in terms of trade with sanctions, that kind of thing. And that completely limits Western margins of movement. I think there's a cynicism about the good that sanctions can do, born of the experience from 1988 up until sort of 2012 or so, when sanctions started to be lifted. Did sanctions actually have any impact, or did they just immiserate the vast majority of the country while allowing the military to maintain their position and feather their own nests? On the other hand, we have the internet and connectivity. So we're much better informed about what's going on inside Myanmar than we were about what was happening in the country back in the old days. And so even though there have been restrictions on mobile internet and that kind of thing, we do get a lot more information about what's happening in the country. The people inside feel much more connected to the outside world. I have a fear that we, in our time as sort of reformers and democratizers, we spread expectations about the liberal world, that where everything was going to be better, and people's hopes and expectations were raised, and now they're being somewhat cruelly dashed as they see the outside world not really doing very much to put the military back into barracks. I think what hasn't changed overall is that the military is absolutely determined to stay in charge, and that they are willing to use extreme violence to do so if they have to. And we've seen that time and time again. So where does the crisis go from here? And I think much as we would all like to see the transition to a full democracy as soon as possible, I think it's unlikely. And I think it's unlikely simply because of the military's strength and control. We're also seeing a kind of polarization of political positions. The pro-democracy forces are becoming much more radical, rather than being satisfied with the compromise that emerged with the sort of 2008 constitution, which the military wrote, which allowed a form of civilian rule, but within this very tight unitary framework. We're seeing some of the pro-democracy forces wanting to talk about a federation, so to give the minority groups around the country's borders more autonomy. That's anathema to the military. Talking of a non-military state, taking the military out of the constitution altogether, again, anathema to the military. So the kind of the space for compromise is getting smaller, and yet anything that any kind of sort of negotiated future from the outside which engages the military is of course by necessity going to end up with some kind of military veto over what's happening, a military role in the constitution, and the military see themselves as guarantors of a unitary state, not a federal state, and that's a real fundamental difference of opinion between the army and the ethnic armed organizations. The military are digging in, planning new elections, perhaps in a year or so. And I don't see the military being overthrown in that period. So I think that means they're going to have to be part of the process, and that's unpleasant, but it's hard to see an alternative at the moment. The economy is in a pretty bad state. The the currency is being devalued, and a lot of businesses, well, the businesses that can move, things like garment production and that sort of thing are pulling out, switching production to Bangladesh or Cambodia, places like that. Telenor, the Norwegian-owned mobile phone company, wrote off the value of its entire investment in Myanmar last week, or the week before, basically, recognizing that it may have to pull out and lose everything that it's spent over the last 10 or so years. The banking system has been on strike, but is being forced to reopen. I think, if things get to worse, if things get worse, the army might do something radical, like nationalize the entire banking system and steal everybody's savings if it gets to that sort of thing, get to that level. Lots of people are unable to go to work, and even people I know, people I used to work with and train with, all suffering financial problems at the moment. What does the military want from this? I think they want legitimacy. I think they want to be recognized as the legitimate government of the country. They want what they call a disciplined, flourishing democracy. And they want, therefore, their own role in the country, I think, entrenched. And they'll have to be pushed to make any concessions at all. So looking for leverage. I'm going to finish there. I haven't really talked about what the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, is going to do, but perhaps we can come back to that in questions. And I'll give a bit of space for Azeem to make his contribution. Thank you.
Bill, as a terrific overview of a very, very complex situation. And as you say, I think we definitely have to talk about ASEAN. So if you don't mind, we're going to come back to you to ask for your specific views, to talk a bit longer about that shortly. But really a pleasure to introduce Azeem again. Eid Mubarak, Azeem, and we really have to thank you especially because as this is the last day of Ramadan, you have some probably family functions to go to. So thank you for taking the time. I know you have to drop off a little bit early. So if we could hand over to you quickly, we'd really like to hear your views as you drill down a bit further.
Thank you so much, Martin, and thank you so much for having me again on the Asia Scotland Institute, and fantastic overview from Bill there, laying the foundations of what's happening. So in terms of building upon what Bill said, he's covered most of the ground in terms of how we actually got here. There was a coup, obviously, in February of this year, in which the military overruled the NLD government, jailed Aung San Suu Kyi on very, very spurious charges originally. We have to remember the original charge that she was charged with was importing walkie-talkies for her security detail, and this was after the military said that the elections from November were very spurious. They did not recognise it. They said it was riddled with fraud, and it was very interesting because governments around the world, the United Nations, the United States, the European Union, they all called for the election results from November 2020 to be respected, for Aung San Suu Kyi to be released from prison. And it was very interesting in terms of how ASEAN approached this situation, which I thought was initially quite clever. ASEAN at that time was chaired by Indonesia, and what they did not ask the election results to be respected. They did not ask Aung San Suu Kyi to be released from prison. What they did ask, however, is to do exactly what the military actually said. So the military, when they first undertook the coup, they said that the election results were fraudulent, which is why they proceeded with the coup, and that they will have new elections within 1 year, which will be free and fair and transparent, and this is how they will return to democracy. So ASEAN, essentially led by Indonesia, only essentially pushed for that. They wanted to hold the military to account for what they proposed themselves. So essentially giving the military a ladder to climb down and an ability to save face, which I thought was quite interesting, and I thought was quite a clever strategy, because the coup, since it's happened, has been an absolute disaster. I don't think anybody in the military anticipated it will go on for this long. The coups in the past, and remember, Myanmar is a country that's been ruled by the military for much of its history. We're very short and swift, but this has actually turned out to be quite a disaster. The uprising, if anything, if there's any silver lining to this, is it's united all the ethnic minority groups. And we have to remember, this is a country that's been at war with every single ethnic minority group since independence. These are the longest running civil wars in the world. This military has been at war almost in its entire existence. I don't know if there's another case like this anywhere else in the world, but these are battle-hardened soldiers. And it's interesting to see how badly they seem to have miscalculated in terms of the coup. And the coup was initially, we'll never know for certain what inspired the military to push for a coup. I myself personally did not believe that there'd be any sort of coup, because the military, I believed, had the holy grail of politics in Myanmar. They had the power without any accountability. They had essentially 25% of the seats in the parliament. They controlled the major ministries, foreign affairs, defense, borders. And so there was absolutely no reason for them to undertake a coup. They were running the country with a veneer of democracy. It was a fundamentally flawed democracy with Aung San Suu Kyi at the head, and they could loot the country. They were enriching themselves, and they could engage in genocide against the Rohingya minority, against other minorities. So the last thing they'd want to do is undertake a coup, put themselves on the front line, and invite international scorn and international sanctions. So when the coup happened, it was actually quite a surprise to a lot of Myanmar watchers, a lot of analysts. And I don't think we'll ever know the full reasons, but I anticipate one of the key reasons was the actual army chief himself, General Min Aung Hlaing, who was due to retire later this year. And I think he became aware that once he retires, is that he'll become a civilian, and at risk will be his personal wealth, his family's wealth, and also any sort of international legal actions against him for genocide. And because there's obviously a case in the ICJ in The Hague on genocide bought by the Gambia. So he probably became aware that he's going to be extremely vulnerable once he retires from the military. And the military in Myanmar is very hierarchical, it's actually very disciplined. And the new army chief could essentially do what the Serbians did in the past and handed over all the war criminals to try to become more part of the international community, or anything could happen. He'd be much more vulnerable. So he instigated the coup to protect himself. So this is one of the theories. We'll never know for certain, as I said, but he instigated the coup, and it's been a huge miscalculation. Now, I am told by some people who have much better knowledge of this than I have, is that there could be a possibility of a counter coup from other generals within the military hierarchy who are very unhappy with the way things have turned out. Myanmar is now on a road to becoming a failed state. The UNDP estimates that by 2022, there'll be another 26 million people in Myanmar in poverty. And this is a country that was already one of the poorest countries in the region. So, this has been an absolute disaster. from even the military's perspective, they have not been able to get control of the situation. And one of the most effective things I think the international community could possibly do is to have targeted sanctions, Magnitsky sanctions against those that are around the army chief, the senior generals. Many of them are not ideologically bent, but they are enriched themselves, have lots of financial holdings in Singapore and Macau and China, not possibly in the West, but to target them, to put pressure on them, to actually then put pressure on General Min Aung Hlaing, the army chief, to try to come to some sort of agreement. I don't anticipate that there'll be a reversal of the coup. One of the reasons the Myanmar military is taking so long in this whole process of even trying to pretend that they're holding elections is they want to make sure that Aung San Suu Kyi and the senior leadership of the NLD go away for a long time. So they're building up the charge sheet against her. They're throwing everything against her. There'll probably be a trial. She'll probably be put away for a number of years. Her political career will be at a complete end. I anticipate then what will happen is that the Myanmar military will form another political party, or they'll use the existing one that they have. They'll participate in the elections, which will then be rigged. They'll come to power again without Aung San Suu Kyi and the NLD, and hence they'll claim that we've gone back to democracy, and they'll continue the process of running the country, which they've always have done. Another obviously interesting development which we have seen transpire recently was a formation of almost a shadow government, the National Unity Government, which was formed in April of this year. And this is made up principally of senior NLD leaderships. And what this has done, to a certain extent, has united many of the ethnic minority groups under one umbrella. And once again, this is probably one of the positive developments that's happened, that's transpired, is that many of the ethnic minority groups are now all protesting against the military. And now they have coming to realize that they are now at the sharp end of the military's violence, just as the military was violent against the Rohingya, the Karen, the Kachin, the Shan, almost every ethnic minority. Now that the military is essentially targeting civilians in Myanmar, so this has united the people, and they have formed almost like a shadow government, which is in opposition to the State Administrative Council, which is the military's which is the military body running the country. So far, there have been senior leadership of the NLD that are running this organization, the National Unity Government. One of the problems with it is that they are being pressured by the international community to recognize the Rohingya, but the propaganda against the Rohingya minority ran so deep within Myanmar that many of them are reluctant to do so. I certainly hope that will change, and I think pressure on that has to be continuously applied. Now, one of the big mistakes I believe that the National Unity Government made is that they recently, just earlier this month, in fact, they announced the formation of a People's Defence Force, which was a military armed wing to take on the military. And 3 days after they announced that, the military, the Tatmadaw, designated the National Unity Government as a terrorist organisation. This was a fundamental mistake, because there's absolutely no way you could take on the military, the Tatmadaw. The military in Myanmar is extremely powerful, is extremely ubiquitous. They are very well armed, very well trained. They have years and years of experience in terms of brutalizing civilian populations. And this has the recipe, this is just a recipe for disaster that will essentially just spiral the country more into violence without any prospect whatsoever of the civilian government trying to make any sort of headway in terms of reclaiming the country. This will just legitimize Myanmar's, the military's brutality, which is, you know, for everybody to see. The estimations of the dead range from 700 to 1,000. Many of them have been shot in the head by long-range sniper rifles. So this is not a scattered fire during a protest. This is deliberate targeting. And in fact, one of the army chiefs actually said during the Armed Forces Day that if anybody comes out in the street, we will shoot them in the head. So this is all information that can be used for future prosecutions in terms of targeting civilians, but they are not holding back in terms of the brutality against everybody, against all civilians. And the announcement of an armed wing simply just plays into their hands, which I think was a fundamental mistake. So what's going to happen from here? Well, we've obviously seen the ASEAN summit with General Min Aung Hlaing turned up, And this was once again seen by many people in Myanmar as a mistake. They spoke out against it simply because this was legitimizing Min Aung Hlaing on the international stage with a huge international body. And he was there, he was meeting with other leaders from ASEAN. They came up with a memorandum of understanding for a number of points to bring the country back to the democratic process. Everybody thought that this is a very positive development. But then once Min Aung Hlaing touched back in Myanmar, he said that, well, look, this is all still up for discussion. So he reneged on much of the commitments that he made at the ASEAN summit. So this was seen as a vehicle for the military just to gain international legitimacy on the international stage. Many people believed that the military played the ASEAN leadership just to gain this legitimacy, and nothing really came out of it. Nothing concrete came out of it. You know, the military simply said that this is all still up for discussion. Nothing was agreed, despite the fact that they seem to have agreed much of this memorandum. So what will happen from here, I think is very difficult to say. I think there's very, very few options from the international community. I think that the initial Indonesian strategy of just holding the military to account for what it claims and what it said that it will do, which is hold elections later this year, I thought that was quite a sound strategy. The probability of the military reversing the coup and releasing Aung San Suu Kyi is next to zero. So that, there's really not much point calling for that, apart from being symbolic, but trying to work with the Myanmar military to hold them to account, work with other military leadership, put pressure on them to put pressure on General Min Aung Hlaing to try to come to some sort of agreement to stop the violence, to have some sort of roadmap back to democracy, whilst the military can still save face, that while still giving some, unfortunately, still giving some guarantees to Min Aung Hlaing. This will be untenable for many people in Myanmar, but it seems like one of the more kind of realistic options to allow him to keep his wealth, allow him to, retain his titles as a savior of Myanmar, whatever, and allow to retire without prosecution. That seems to be a realistic option, but obviously that's not for me to decide. This is for the people of Myanmar, but the situation is very difficult, and I don't think anybody anticipated we'd be here. Everyone thought, including the military, there'll be a swift coup, the military would retain control of the country, the people will go back home, and the whole country would just tick over as it had in the past. So I'll just stop there, Martin, and I'll be happy to take questions when they arise.
Thank you very much, Azeem. Very insightful, as usual. And we do have quite a few questions. I'd like to jump straight into them because I know your time with us is limited today. If I could ask several together, if you don't mind, and perhaps you first, and then we can come to Bill. Bill, we're definitely going to ask you about ASEAN and also China, but before we come on to that, Giles Chance has asked us, is the insurrection about democratic rule, or are there other key factors? I know you have both gone into that, but I just want to highlight the question again. Also, Martin Allen has said, who has spoken to Prime Minister Aung San Suu Kyi? Which is relevant as well. Is she really safe, and what might happen to her? You said something about that. Perhaps we can draw that out. And then thirdly, if I could just put them into context, Azeem, both of you, Bill also, I think, have spoken about the strength of the Myanmar military. They are a somewhat professionalized military in Asia. They're well armed, well trained, but this is quite a widespread insurrection. It's obviously not the entire population, but large parts of the population. In addition, the Karen in the south and east, and the and also the Kachin in the east can fight. They've been doing so for many years. Whilst the military can handle those border insurrections for many years, can it really handle the border insurrections that are increased, plus widespread urban insurrection? Is there a tipping point for this? So perhaps you could just say a little bit more about those points.
I can go first, Martin. So in terms of whether this is, protests for democratic rule or something else, it's actually very interesting that when you actually see who is protesting and where they're protesting. So if you're in the major cities, in Yangon and Naypyidaw, you see that the protesters are out, they're holding pictures of Aung San Suu Kyi, release Mother Sue is one of the key kind of slogans. You also see, a return to democracy. But outside the major outside the major cities, where there's a larger proportion of the ethnic minority groups, you see that the protests are a little bit different. You see individuals protesting in their national dress. So they wear their national ethnic dress. They are calling for an inclusion of their ethnic groups into the democratic process. So they're not protesting necessarily for the release of Aung San Suu Kyi. They're protesting more against the military brutality that they have been experiencing for decades. But they're all essentially now protesting against the military, but they now have different wants and different requirements. So that's very interesting in terms of how that has been divided. So not everybody's keen on having Aung San Suu Kyi back, simply because that they felt that she was a failure and she did not stand up for the ethnic minority group. So they're protesting more against the military and more against having a full and proper democratic process. So in terms of Aung San Suu Kyi, who has been in touch with her, I don't know. I think she was completely isolated in prison. She had a court appearance recently, and I think this was the first time, I believe, that the international community actually managed to see her. Before that, she's simply been in prison, and the military keep piling on more and more charges onto her, hoping that some of them will stick. Some of them are really bizarre. Some of them are a bit more substantive. In terms of what the military can hope will stick. But as I said, I anticipate her political career is completely over. I think she's finished. I think they'll put her away for a long time, and they might put her into a house arrest or something of that nature. But she'll be completely isolated. Her party will be dissolved. And there's a very unfortunate end to somebody who's a major human rights icon, particularly when you see that she became an apologist for the military, an apologist for genocide, which she clearly did when she turned up at the ICJ, saying that no such genocide or killing has occurred, and she actually said that the military of Myanmar is simply not capable of this kind of action, and this was a wake-up call for many people around the globe who supported her right up until the end.
Azeem, thank you very much. Perhaps if we could switch across. Bill, I don't want to ask you the same questions because we have a few others and we really want to satisfy some of the audience members. I'll just read several if I can, and then feed that into what I hope you can say about ASEAN. So William Hanbury Tension has asked, is China the source or solution to the Myanmar situation, or neither of the above? Andrew Wright has asked, what view are the Chinese taking? We know they're supplying equipment and would like the mineral wealth under their control. Secondly, what are the Russians up to? Are they trying to fill a void in Southeast Asia? Actually, the last time Azeem was with us, he spoke somewhat about Chinese influence on Myanmar, and also the independence of the Myanmar military in rejecting some of that influence. But could you put that all into context, especially with ASEAN, because you had a few remarks about ASEAN, and sort of step back on these wider relationships?
Yeah. I think China's number one interest in Myanmar is stability, and maybe the chance to make money as well. It sees Myanmar as a kind of a connecting node, if you like, to places to the west. It has this sort of corridor idea that it's constructed these oil and gas pipelines that go down into the Bay of Bengal. It wants to build a railway, building on the railway that the British built a century ago, but making it a kind of a high-speed connection. And I think they were probably as blindsided by the coup as everybody else. It's a very complicated thing. The Myanmar military, the Tatmadaw, are, if they're one thing, they're paranoid. They're nationalistic. They don't really like anybody, frankly. They don't like anybody telling them what to do. And so there's probably a sense, I think, that the Aung San Suu Kyi civilian government had better relations with the government in China than the military did. And certainly you've seen the Southeast Asian countries coordinate some of, or the ones that are interested in doing something, coordinate their response with China. Because I think there's, everybody thinks that, if there's an opportunity, China will take it, and there's no point trying to do anything that doesn't involve China. To be honest, I think actually this is although all our talk is of US-China confrontation at the moment, or competition, I think this is one issue where the US and China are on the same side. They could both work together, to kind of try to reach, pressure the military into some kind of compromise, a kind of united front that involved, China and the US and India would be, quite, and the Southeast Asian countries would be quite impressive, I think. The mineral wealth is a big, but the jade mines, they're a law unto themselves. The jade trade is, it's riddled with corruption. It's unregulated. It'll be, whatever happens in terms of sanctions, it'll be a way that the junta can get money, and quite a lot of money, frankly, because jade is incredibly expensive. So I don't see China as the source of the problem. I think it could be part of the solution. But it's, the fact that it's there means that everybody else's diplomatic options are constrained. Russia, I think, just wants to sell guns. I think that's its main interest in Myanmar. I don't think it's thinking in terms of, having a strategic base on the Bay of Bengal or anything like that at the moment. I remember a Russian ship turning up in Yangon one day when I was living there, and we all went down to visit it. And then a local big business person, the kind of people that get called cronies, turned up, and he was a middleman between the Russian arms dealers and the military, I think. So that's their interest. What can ASEAN do? The Southeast Asian countries? Well, I think they're split basically. I think the Thais probably see some kind of tacit alliance of convenience with the coup. To be honest, it sort of means they're less likely to get criticised since they're a similar kind of military regime. Interestingly, I think the Vietnamese are a bit too friendly with the coup. The Vietnamese Ministry of Defence owned mobile operator Viettel has a very big joint venture with the Myanmar Army's joint venture Mytel. And Vietnam is something like the 4th or 5th largest investor, mainly because of that deal in Myanmar. And I suspect that the Vietnamese think that the Myanmar military is as suspicious of China as they are, and so maybe they can sort of see a kind of an alliance of convenience there. Cambodia and Laos aren't going to rock the boat too much. So the countries that have been doing most of the running, Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore to an extent, Brunei, I think, wants, as chair of ASEAN this year, would like, I think, to avoid having to manage a difficult diplomatic process. So you sort of see the start of a diplomatic process, but it's going to be a very long process. ASEAN has basically reached this consensus, they call it, and if Myanmar insists on defying it, then it starts to call into question the credibility of ASEAN. And I think at that point, the Southeast Asian countries might start to get a bit more active. It's going to take time, though.
Yeah, can I just comment on that as well, Martin? Yeah, I think Bill's absolutely right. I think there's an assumption that China is somehow behind this coup and facilitated it, though there was, a meeting between one of the Chinese foreign ministries and one of the military leaders just before the coup. So how much did China know? I don't think we'll ever know, but the fact is that the military did have that meeting. So did they inform China that the coup was in the pipeline? We simply don't know. But China's reaction to the coup was very interesting. China issued a statement that they described this as a cabinet reshuffle in Myanmar when the military took over. So I think that was very indicative in terms of what they were actually thinking. China's much more interested in stability. I don't think they really care who's in power in Myanmar, whether it's Aung San Suu Kyi or the military, as long as they have stability, as long as their contracts are honoured, and as long as they can continue with their investment and the geopolitical machinations in the region. And it's also interesting to see how the military, how China, in terms of their interest in the region. So they don't only have the Belt and Road Initiative in Myanmar through the, China-Myanmar economic corridor. They also have interest in geopolitical interests China has aspirations to become a global superpower. But they know that before they can become a global superpower, it must become a regional power. And that means keeping its regional nuclear rival, India, in check. Access to Myanmar gives it access to the Bay of Bengal and the Indian Ocean. And thus they can completely surround India through and avoid the Straits of Malacca and, through the string of perils strategy. So you have these geopolitical machinations and calculations going on between China, Myanmar, the United States, who's trying to keep it outside the sphere of influence of China. So the situation is not just economic. China is looking for stability, and the Tatmadaw is almost like the North Koreans. They're very suspicious of outsiders. The people are very suspicious of China's interest in the region as well. So China, I think, thought that the coup would happen. There's a cabinet reshuffle. The military will take full control of the country, and they'll continue as they are with their interest in the country. But obviously now with the instability, much of China's strategy is also being called into question.
Then perhaps just before you go, one last question. I think sort of coming back to what you studied a great deal. There are several people in the audience who've asked about some of the human rights issues. Peter Bradley, why the atrocities towards civilians and particularly children not being more widely reported in the media? Bill can talk about that from the BBC in a minute, but also from Catriona, however her actions at the ICJ were very popular with the Myanmar people who were her electorate. I don't want to minimize what happened in Rakhine. I think it's important to look at that particular choice through her role as a national politician and not as an international role model. Would you like to say something about that in relation to Aung San Suu Kyi?
Sure. Yeah, so obviously Aung San Suu Kyi herself said, when she was called as a human rights icon, she said, "I'm not a human rights icon, I'm actually a politician." And I think the miscalculation that she made is, is for everybody to see, is that once you become an apologist for genocide, she was on the side of the military. She made all sorts of excuses for them. When the BBC asked her, Fergal Keane from the BBC asked her that ethnic cleansing is going on in your country, she said, ethnic cleansing is far too strong a term to use. Both sides are equally to blame, drawing a comparison between the victim and the perpetrators. When the UN produced a report in March 2017, and 52% of the Rohingya females had been raped. So the majority of them, she said, this is fake rape. So once you become an apologist for genocide, and her legacy is now in complete tatters, she will go down in history as the great hope and icon of Myanmar, as a Nobel laureate, as the daughter of the founding general of Myanmar. But this is now will be her legacy, and I fully accept that she didn't actually have a lot of power as a civilian leader. The military still ran the show, but she could have used her most powerful weapon, which she continuously refused to do so, which was her voice. She could have spoken up. She was very popular in Myanmar. She was polling 70 to 80% on a regular basis. She could have brought the people with her and shown some sort of leadership, maybe not full-scale reintegration of the Rohingya back into society, but at least spoken out and saying, look, this is not the Myanmar way, this is not the Burma way, this is not the Buddhist way of engaging in this kind of behavior. And she continuously refused to do so. And now her legacy is in complete tatters. Which is what happens when you become an apologist for genocide.
Very sad indeed. In fact, for someone who was so highly regarded and revered. Really, thank you very much. As we've said before, we're waiting for you back in Scotland. Hope to see you soon in the summer, or certainly this year. When things get better and open up. So if you need to jump off, we're really grateful for your time today.
Thanks so much for having me, Martin. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Bill, can I switch back to you for just a little bit more, perhaps, on not specifically the human rights issues, but obviously it's what concerns Western electorates, frankly, and they have voting power and influence on our governments. We have a question from Nandini, who's quite one of our regular participants. What are the concrete policies which will be undertaken by international bodies such as the UN for the protection of women and children? And I'd just like to put that in context of what Azeem was talking about with some of the issues that have taken place with Aung San Suu Kyi and not speaking up for in regard to certain issues, Rakhine especially. Are these international bodies going to have an impact on the government in Myanmar or on other governments in pressuring government in Myanmar, or will the solution only come from the government in Myanmar, the military?
Yeah, this is the tough one, I think. The solution isn't going to come from the government in Myanmar. I don't think it can happen without their participation, simply because they're in control of the country, or most of the country, shall we say. I mean, they're not in control of the border areas where the ethnic armed groups are. They're not in control fully of the city streets, but the sort of the majority of the country, I think, is under their control. So therefore, they're going to be part of whatever comes out. The international community has got a lot of issues to think about. I mean, the Rohingya issue, 800,000 people in refugee camps in Bangladesh. I mean, they've been there, almost 4 years, many of them. And there were initial attempts at sanctions, but they didn't really get anywhere. There've been attempts to try and facilitate their return. It's very hard, I think, to overestimate the degree of anti-Muslim prejudice among the Bama majority in Myanmar. The Bama meaning the sort of majority ethnic group, the lowlanders, if you like. I can see how the army, basically was doing in northwestern Rakhine State the kind of thing it had been doing in the Chin areas, the Kachin areas, where they just clear areas and push people out over the borders into that, in that case, into China or into sort of remote areas. And they thought they were doing the same kind of operation, a kind of clearance operation. And in the past, Bangladesh, there have been previous incidents where the army did this, back in the 60s and the early 80s. And to be honest, the Bangladesh government threatened to arm the Rohingya at that point unless the Myanmar military backed down, and then that encouraged the Myanmar military to let the refugees go back. This time, no such threat has been made, and so there's been no sort of negotiation. China's been attempting to facilitate a process for the Rohingya to go back, but it hasn't really got very far. So there's that. There's also the other issues on the border with the other ethnic groups, and then there's the whole democratization thing. ASEAN is talking about sending an envoy, about having some kind of humanitarian aid to reach people. The EU, I was listening to something yesterday, has cancelled all its government-to-government aid and is redirecting it to non-governmental organisations and things that are outside the military's control. I imagine that other governments will be doing the same thing. But of course, how do you get this money actually into the places where it's needed in the current circumstances? It's going to require, I'd have thought, subterfuge, to be honest, to get it in there. And yes, there is a sort of UN human rights envoy, special envoy. She actually had a meeting with the senior general Min Aung Hlaing at the ASEAN summit in April, but I don't think she's going to be allowed to go into the country. So it's really hard. I think at the moment what we're looking for is points of pressure that could be exerted on the junta to make them compromise and allow some kind of humanitarian intervention and to encourage a political process. And a lot of those, I think, are in the hands of some of the Southeast Asian countries. Singapore has a lot of money from Myanmar bank accounts in its banks. Vietnam has this cooperation on mobile phones and satellite communication. Thailand, has sort of buys a lot of gas to generate electricity in the country. These are all things that they could decide to squeeze the junta if they really wanted to. So I don't think we're sort of powerless here. But the EU, when we were still part of it, imposed sanctions on some people in Myanmar in response to the Rohingya episode 3 or 4 years ago. It made no difference whatsoever. So I'm kind of skeptical about how much difference sanctions are going to make in the short term. Maybe in the long term they'll have an effect.
Bill, we're sort of drawing to a close, but we do have a couple of questions, and I'd like to ask the last one, if I may, on your own. I apologise, but from William Knight, who's been a long-term member of the Asia Scotland Institute, and William has spent quite a long time in Myanmar, quite deep in Myanmar, I would say, and is very experienced in the country. Williams asked, what will ASEAN do when it's Myanmar's turn to take over the presidency? And then secondly, amongst the ethnic groups, is a coherent leader emerging? And perhaps just to sort of position that question as the last one, especially in regard to what William said as in regard to the insurgency, is this permanent chaos coming out of this, or will the government misstep? And thinking back to what we were talking about with Azeem, it's actually quite difficult for governments to fight prolonged crisis, and many governments tend to misstep. Despite the fact they may look very robust from the outside, probably chaotic in the decision-making process. If you have a conflict in the north, in the east, in the urban areas, maintaining control can break down quite quickly. How do you see this going? And Bill's question about, William's question about presidency of ASEAN as well.
Right. I'll start there. Fortunately for ASEAN, the presidency goes in alphabetical order. And we're just at Brunei. So we've got 6 years until we get to Myanmar. So fingers crossed, this will be some kind of, compromise process will be underway by the time we get to 6 years' time. A more acute problem is you have the foreign ministers meeting it's usually in August, and then there's usually the leaders summit, usually in November time. So the foreign ministers, you could sort of imagine, it's 16 hours. They have the ASEAN Regional Forum and various other things. So the Americans go and the EU go. Britain has now become a dialogue partner of ASEAN for the first time since we left the EU. This is a kind of quite a big step forward. Whether we'll be formally in place by the summit, I'm not entirely sure. Anyway, so we might be going as well, or foreign minister might be going. So are we going to sit down with the junta's foreign minister and have a chat just like everything's normal? Or are we going to talk about the ASEAN leaders and Myanmar like they're a separate case? And then what are we going to do? That might be possible for foreign ministers, but when it gets to the summit in November, assuming Joe Biden goes, he's probably going to be invited. Does he want to go to be in the same room as Min Aung Hlaing? So it starts to become a bit of a diplomatic issue, I think, at that point. Obviously, if we're still in the same boat when ASEAN's leadership comes around to Myanmar's turn, it'll be a much bigger problem. Your other question was about, all these different, can the military stay control if all these pressure points are at the same time? It gets difficult. Maybe it becomes thin. Maybe we are heading to, I think there's a sort of consensus in many ways, we are heading towards a failed state, a state that can't run its own economy, can't raise taxation. These things. I mean, I'm not a fan of gunboat diplomacy, but I was just wondering if, and I'm speculating here, Britain is about to send a carrier strike group off to the Asia Pacific region. If it was to do a kind of slow cruise along the coast of Myanmar, that would stretch the military, quite in another direction. It might be another sort of point of pressure. I'm not suggesting we can do anything serious, but it's the kind of if you want to put pressure on the Myanmar military, you've got to think creatively about all the different ways that this can be done. But I'm just wondering whether I'm out of time. Many more things to say.
Well, I think we'd better stop there. That was most of the questions, and there are some more, but we could keep going. I think you summed it up. There's a risk of it being a failed state, as you said, economically and politically, and clearly that necessitates someone to do something. I'm not sure if it would be HMS Queen Elizabeth and the crew, but perhaps the People's Republic of China, noting that there are PLA military units that cruise in the tri-state area of the Mekong to maintain control in other states outside of China, and that's agreed with those states. So it's really the only power in the region, perhaps, with the ability to bring peace in there. But wider question for your book, I hope. I think your next book hopefully is on this subject. Can I hand back to Roddy, Chairman, to close? Roddy.
Yeah, thank you very much, Martin. I promised Billy that he could show a copy of his book, which he's pushing hard now. So, ladies and gentlemen, take a good look. The title is
The Invention of China. So it's kind of looking back to debates in China in the late 19th, early 20th century about nation and nationalism and territory and how they link to today's issues with South China Sea and Tibet and Xinjiang and all that kind of stuff.
There you are. And look, Martin's got a copy as well. So nobody ever say we don't want to push the cases and the causes of our excellent panelists. And excellent they were. But I'd like to thank you and Azeem, now he's popped off, for a very, very interesting discussion of what is quite a specialized topic. But I think it seems to be in one of those sort of fault lines that we talked about the Balkans, we talked about challenges in the past in the Baltic states, the things that could go wrong, and finding Myanmar, as it were, squished between the issues in Thailand, what's going on in Bangladesh, being a neighbor of China, with Russia looking around. Let nobody say that there aren't plenty of areas of tension in the world. And one of the things we hope we can do as an institute, and have certainly done with this webinar, is get people to think about some of the challenging issues that are faced. And as you said to me before the start of the webinar, when I asked you what Singapore could do in terms of freezing assets of the generals, your comment was that wouldn't exactly encourage other people to invest in Singapore themselves, fearing what might happen. So who knows? But to everybody who made this webinar possible, that's the attendees, the panelists, Martin, Andrew, Rick, and the team, thank you all very much. And until we meet again, our next topic, I think, being a Glasgow City College, where the principal will speak to us. And then not long after that, we're going to be looking again at the issues in Afghanistan. And after that, US foreign policy towards China in particular. So thank you, everybody. And when it comes, wherever you are, have a great weekend. And thanks for joining us today. Bye-bye.